This is going to be our final talk of the semester. Thank you very much for coming today. It will be given by Dr. Julia Mörchen from the University of Leipzig, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behaviour, who will be giving a talk titled Social Learning and Cultural Transmission in the Context of Migration, Insights from Two Orangutan Populations. This talk is going to be recorded, which is just something to bear in mind if you do want to respond in the Q&A portion of the session, which we'll be having in the last 15 minutes as usual. If everyone could please keep their microphones and cameras off for the duration of the talk, just to minimize any Wi-Fi problems, that would be great. If at the end, when you ask a question, you want to turn your camera on, that's fine. Just use the raise hand function, I'll call on you. Or as usual, you can pop your questions in the chat and I'll read them out. So yeah, I think that's everything. I'll hand over to Julia now and let you get started.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'm Julia Mörchen, and I'm very happy to have this chance to talk about some of the results of my PhD thesis. I worked with orangutans and particularly social learning and cultural transmission in orangutans. And today I want to present you some insights we got by looking at social learning in the context of migration. And we did this in two orangutan populations. So I want to start. I hope this works. Yeah, okay. So our species, Homo sapiens, we originated approximately 300,000 years ago in Africa. And since then, humans not only have colonized the entire planet, but we also adapted to an exceptionally wide range of habitats. And the key to our success has often been appointed to our unique cultural abilities. So first, our ability to innovate, or to come up with new solutions to problems. Second, our ability to cumulatively refine those innovations. And third, to preserve them by sharing them with others via social learning. So whenever people moved to new places, they took their cultural artifacts with them, leading to cultural spread over time and space. And the rich archaeological record of cultural artifacts left by these people show that they must have been a very heavy exchange of migrant-driven cultural transmission. However, it is not possible to use this archaeological record to reconstruct the immediate social learning condition of these ancient peoples. So, what is social learning and why is it so important? Broadly speaking, social learning can be divided into two categories. So the first one is learning by attending to social information, either via non-observational forms or observational forms, which requires to pay focused attention to the learning target. Second category is social learning through the social interaction with another individual, such as during interaction, conditioning, or during teaching. Social learning can be very beneficial since it allows an individual to avoid the risks and costs of own exploration and to acquire knowledge much more faster and efficient. And importantly, social learning is also the precondition for the emergence of culture, which can be defined as the sum of all socially transmitted innovations in a given cultural unit. Social learning theory predicts that the direction of information flow usually goes from the less experienced individual to the expert. The other way around, from the expert to the less experienced individual. And in the case of young individuals who are considered to need to learn most of the things in life, large amount of information comes actually from their own parents, who share important skills and information with them, such as how to do a certain task. However, between adult individuals who already have learned most of the skills, it is expected that they share information about the environment or the social constellation of a group. So they don't necessarily share information about skills, but rather where and when are certain resources, for example, or who is who and the identities of a social constellation. In primates particularly, it has been proposed that there are three phases where social learning is especially relevant. The first phase is during infancy, where the first role model to learn from usually would be the primary caregiver, which is usually on mother. Then with increasing age, the second phase would be when individuals grow much older and they will gradually learn from a much wider range of pool of group members, such as peers. And then the third phase would be social learning after dispersal. However, in contrast to the first and the second phase, the third phase poses new challenges for the learning individual. This is because after leaving the own area and arriving in a new area, the individual is actually faced with different challenges of the habitat and an unknown constellation of social individuals. This is also important because innovations that are shared between individuals often convey fitness advantages. So it is expected that individuals stand in a selection with regard to their social learning biases. So social learning biases means from whom or what to learn and when to engage in social learning. So it can be, social learning could be, for example, beneficial in a situation where the individual is uncertain or new, or social learning can be influenced by the characteristics of the role model, such as learning from an individual which has a high rank or good knowledge. When it comes to what is the subject of social learning, individuals can take the frequency of an innovation as a cue for its potential value. So is it very commonly found in the area or is it very rare? And these social learning biases are evolutionarily significant because in the end, they will determine the richness and the quality of an individual's own cultural repertoire, which in turn it then needs to deal with the daily challenges of survival and reproduction. And over a given time, they also influence the cultural diversity of a given cultural unit. However, as you can imagine, there's like extensive variation according to the species social system, the age, the experience, and so on. And these factors who influence these biases are not fully understood yet. If we come now to the case of, for example, a migrant and a local individual, so let's say strangers or individuals who likely are not, they don't have a genetically anchored interest to be immediately cooperative with each other, how can they engage in beneficial social exchange? So benefits of such encounters could be, for example, individuals learn new knowledge from another individual, which could be helpful when adapting to a new habitat, or it could provide an advantage when dealing with times of uncertainty and scarcity, and it could also lead to a mutual beneficial relationship. On the other hand, of course, there are costs involved. Individuals compete over resources, of course. There is always the risk of disease transmission and or also accidentally learning wrong or even harmful information. So this system can only really evolve when the benefit outweighs the cost. So let's come now to orangutans. So for my PhD, I had some of the model species, and they're very well suited to ask questions of social learning and culture. So they're very closely related to us. We have a common ancestry, and we share approximately 97% of our genes with them. And they're very highly cultural grade apes. So they show extensive innovation repertoires in the wild, and they live in a very complex feeding need. And further, wild orangutans are also known to exhibit quite strong neophobia and show a great reliance on social learning over individual learning for the acquisition of their skill set. And this is well studied in the mother-offspring context, where usually the mother serves as a role model for the infants. Third, in contrast to the other great apes of chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas, they do not live in groups, but they are semi-solitary and they live in an individual-based distribution system. This is really good for us as researchers because it allows us to track opportunities for social learning between individuals. Another reason why orangutans are well suited are that they have very distinct dispersal system. They reach sexual maturity at about 15 years of age, and then the females are philopatric, so they will settle close to their home range, to the natural homes, and the males then will start to disperse. And they will engage in long-distance dispersal. And at the onset of dispersal, they are in the so-called unfledged male state, and then later eventually will mature into the fledged male state. And we don't know actually the absolute distances of traveling and dispersal of these individuals, of these males, but it must be, like, there are some genetic studies that suggest that it's quite, like it's at least 4.1 larger away than females would settle after reaching sexual maturity. And as with other primates, dispersal likely comes at a lot of challenges. So when they move to new areas, they are like confronted with the unknown habitat. They don't know the food yet, and they also don't really know nothing about the social constellation of orangutans that inhabit these areas already. And another reason we think about that these males might have a different culture is that with increasing geographic distance, cultural differences also increases. So it's quite reasonable to assume that these migrating males, after leaving the area and coming into a new area, will possess a different cultural knowledge than the local orangutans. And this has led me to my research questions. So the first question we asked us was, how different are those migrants and local orangutans actually in their cultural repertoire? So what is the potential for cultural exchange between these two classes? The second big question was then, do they engage in social learning from each other by showing a certain behavior which we call peering? I'm going to explain in a bit what's this about. Here I looked at different questions of this peering behavior, or whether it's directed at different role models, the content in the feeding domain, its context, whether they practice after peering, and how peering would develop over increasing residency with the males. And the third big question was then to assess how resource availability and also social tolerance would affect the peering opportunities, but also peering propensities in migrant and in local orangutans. As I mentioned in the beginning, for this thesis, I had data from 2 orangutan populations, 2 species, which is very, very cool to have this kind of data at hand. And so I had data from the Sumatran orangutans here in red at the Suak station, and from the Bornean orangutans in blue from the Tuanan station. And the comparison of these 2 populations is very interesting, because the 2 islands, they differ in their forest productivity. So while in both populations food availability fluctuates with time, in Sumatra there's a much higher overall food availability than in Borneo, which leads to less competition in Sumatra than in Borneo for the individuals. And due to the higher food availability, Sumatran orangutans also live at much higher densities. They spend much more time in association with each other, and this provides them with much more opportunities for social learning than their counterparts in Borneo. And over evolutionary time, it has led that Sumatran orangutans are much more social and have higher levels of sociability and tolerance than the Bornean orangutans. So, but how does this social learning, putative social learning, actually look like? So I mentioned this peering behavior, and peering has been studied in wild and in captive image orangutans so far. And it is a measure of observational social learning. And it is defined as an individual is directly looking at the actions of another individual for at least 5 seconds and at a close enough range. And I'm going to show you a video. So here you see on the right side the peerer. This is the individual that shows the behavior peering, who's looking on peering at the activities of the peering target, the other orangutan on the left side. And yeah, as you can see, they pay close attention, they get very close up and look at every kind of detail what the other one is doing. And using this behavior as a measurement is interesting, because you can look at all kinds of variables of this specific moment. So who are these individuals? Maybe how long have they been in the area? What is subject of peering, and so on. Yeah. So The studies I did then were based on long-term data, which consists of more than 30 years. And in my first study, I investigated specifically the peering behavior of migrant males after dispersal, directed at local individuals, which we published in Frontiers. In my second study, then, I looked at the effect of food availability and close proximity on peering opportunities and propensities on migrants' peering behavior, which we published in eScience. And my third study, which is still in preparation to be published, we then looked at the other way around. So we investigated whether migrants can act as cultural vectors by being subject of peering themselves by local individuals. And in this study, also for the first time, we looked at the cultural repertoires of the locals and the migrants, which on a dyadic level, which has not been done before. And I'm going to present you these results. And yeah, the fourth study is just we established a new orangutan project in Sumatra, but I'm going to focus on some of the results of these three papers. A quick guide through the methods. So as orangutan researchers, we all use the same protocol to allow comparison between the sites, of course. We have focal animal sampling at 2-minute intervals, and yeah, we use identical methods at both sites. And for this cases, I had quite a high sample size on peering events for both locals and migrants. And here I quickly would like to guide you through the main structure of the two main analyses. So for the repertoire overlap analysis, I used the dyadic dice coefficient, and with subsequent matrix permutation test, of course, only of highly sampled individuals. And here I looked specifically at overlap in diets of food species repertoires and nesting tree species repertoires. For the peering analysis, it took the general form of peering events as a response, and then per day on diet, and then controlled for the time the peering diet has been in association, and controlled for the time the target, for example, fed on the food item that day. And we included all kinds of controls and into the analysis. So now finally we come to the first result. So the first question was, what is actually the potential for cultural exchange? So we looked at repertoires. And here the question was, do they differ, the migrants and the locals in their repertoire? And due to the long distance dispersal of the males, and therefore the likely different cultural origins, I predicted that local migrant diets will have a lower overlap in their food repertoires than the local diets. And so here now you see the result of, we have on the x-axis, you see the diet combinations, the different groups that were compared. And on the y-axis, you see the dice coefficient, which ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 meaning that there is no overlap in dyadic composition, and 1 representing identical repertoires between two individuals. And every observation point is the coefficient for one diet consisting of two individuals. And then I did the matrix permutation test, and here in red for SUAC, in the red plot, you see that in line with the prediction, the local had a significant higher overlap in their feeding repertoires than the migrant local diets. Similar we found also in blue for the Tuanan orangutans, although it was not significant. And I repeated the same analysis, but now for nesting tree species repertoire, and I found a similar pattern. And these results show that local and migrant possesses overlapping, but also distinct cultural knowledge, and therefore that there's a great potential for cultural exchange between migrants and locals. And additionally, since we already know that local females strictly avoid contact with other local females, despite living in the same area and having highly overlapping home ranges, I conclude that the high local similarity likely comes from ecological availability, thus living in the same habitat. So, given the choice now, do migrants actually engage in social learning from locals, and if so, who would they learn from? So this is now the second question. We wanted to see whether adult migrants can use this peering behavior to socially learn from locals. And I present to you here the results from the migrants' perspective. So if migrants use peering behavior to socially learn new knowledge after dispersal, in theory, they should direct their peering at those individuals that have the most complete knowledge, and these are the local adult philopatric females. That's why I predicted that they would peer the most at them. And actually, we found that this prediction was true for the Sumatran population. So in red, we found that in line with the prediction that migrants, the Sumatran migrants, peered the most at local adult females, followed then by peering at adult unfledged males, and the least at immatures. So you see here on the x-axis the different peering targets, and on the y-axis the migrants' peering rate controlled for association time. However, when we look at the data from Tuanan in blue, we found that in this less social population, that migrants peered most at other unfledged males, followed by peering at local immatures, and the least at philopatric females, so in contrast to the prediction. And it appears that in the most sociable population, in Sumatra, migrants preferably choose local adult females to peer at, but at Tuanan, local females are known to be less socially tolerant towards other individuals, likely due to the high levels of competition, and therefore migrants can choose other adults or even other locals like immatures to peer at. However, peering at young orangutans and non-locals always, of course, bears the risk of attending to inaccurate or incomplete information. So in this way, we like to conclude here that the peering biases are guided by attending to experts if available and possible, and that social tolerance is one of the key factors to be able to peer at all. If we go a little bit more into detail, we wanted to look at the peering behavior within the feeding context. And in order to answer the question whether they would learn about local foods, the migrants, I ranked each food item in the total record of each study area. And I ranked it based on the time it had been consumed in the total area. So this is, for example, for 215 years of data. It means that some food items are very rarely eaten only, and some food items are very commonly fed on. And here I predicted that migrants should peer the most at locally rare foods, since those are likely the one items that are most likely new to them. And yeah, in line with the prediction, this is also what I found. We found that that the peering significantly decreased with decreasing rarity of the food item. So they peered more at rare items than at commonly found ones. And when I repeated the same analysis for the locals peering at migrants, I found a similar pattern. So in this case, these results are in line with the frequency-dependent bias, where the frequency of an innovation is actually somehow a cue for its potential value to the individual. And similar biases have also been found in immature orangutans, but also in capuchin monkeys, who peer the most at rare foods, but in those cases, rare foods in their own mother's diet. So not in the overall diet, but in their own mother's diet. Within this model, I also looked at the food item's complexity. So next to the food item's rarity, we wanted to assess whether the difficulty to process a food item also could have an influence on the peering rates. So each food item was then categorized according to the number of steps it needs to be done to be successfully ingested. So some items are very easily to process, like a leaf, and some items are very difficult to process, like these are foods that require even tool use. And with regard to my adult migrants' peering pattern, I expected that food item processing intensity should not actually influence the peering behavior, because they are already adult and they should be already competent with many different feeding techniques, including complex ones. However, against our prediction, we found the opposite pattern. So we found that with increasing food item processing intensity, you see this here on the x-axis, the migrant peering rates also increased, and this was true for both populations. And this is quite surprising. And yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, skill learning is especially pronounced, or is expected to be especially pronounced in immature individuals and less prominent in adult individuals. And I found a similar pattern also for the adult females when they appear back to the migrant males. So we concluded that skill learning might actually be something that continues into adulthood, at least in orangutans, and that this could be, especially in times, could be important in times of when being new in an area, or when being confronted with a new environment. And interestingly, skill learning into adulthood is a very human trait, and at least something which we are very good at with our lifelong learning. Next, I wanted to show you here how does the peering decreases with increasing residency. So if peering is actually a means of social learning, one would expect that with increasing time spent in the area, the male's peering should decrease. And this is also what we found. So particularly in the first months, peering is quite high, and then over time, it decreases with the months the male has spent in the area. And this was also again true for both populations again. And it would be interesting to look at whether this increase in peering behavior correlates with an increase in ecological competence. And this has been found actually in immature orangutans. So I've brought you here the results of Shubli et al., who found that immature peering decreases with increasing age, and it goes along with an increase in competency. So this is something we are going to look at in the future, which would be very interesting. And now I bring you the last result, I promise. So the last paper, we wanted to quantify and to check whether and how food availability actually affects the peering behavior. And as I mentioned a bit already in the introduction, I have to explain a little bit here that, as you remember, food availability impacts association time and also close proximity between individuals due to competition. And this pattern is especially pronounced between non-kin individuals. And further, we have empirical but also theoretical studies that have shown that in good times, individuals tend to engage more in social learning while relying more on own knowledge when the times are not so good. So based on these, I predicted that migrants would peer more when food availability is high. And in line with our predictions, we found that actually, indeed, orangutans from both populations, that the peering rates would increase with increasing local food availability. And here you see on the x-axis, on the y-axis, you see the migrant probability, peering probability over prevailing habitat food availability. And on the x-axis, the food availability ranging from very low, here, 0 to very high. And the plot shows the model predictions in the horizontal lines and the confidence intervals in the vertical lines. And the occurrence of the peering events are shown by either being 0 with the small circles being 0 or by 1 being up here. And interestingly, this phi effect was also stable while controlling for all the other factors which I've shown you beforehand now. So we controlled for close proximity, we controlled for male time in the area, age, sex, class, and association time, of course. So it appears that phi modulates the utilization of social learning opportunities. In other words, migrant orangutans make increased use of social learning opportunities when food availability is high. We don't know yet what is the real mechanism behind it, but it could be a side effect of increased sociability in these moments, or maybe even physiologically triggered. But yeah, we don't know yet. And interestingly, when I repeated the same analysis for the locals peering at the migrants, we did not find any effect of food availability on them, which could point into the direction that they are not affected due to the locational advantage of living in their home area. And when we now look at the differences between the two populations in peering propensities, we also found that in Sumatra and Suak, the overall peering probability was much higher than in Tuanan. So as I mentioned in the beginning, due to the higher forest productivity, there are much more opportunities for social learning in Sumatra. And the idea is that orangutans that grew up in Sumatra might have experienced significantly increased social learning opportunities when growing up than the counterparts in Borneo, and therefore might have developed an increased overall tendency to use social learning when they are in their later lives, so when they're adults. And over evolutionary time, these differences then got genetically fixed between these two populations that split approximately 607,000 years ago. So the explanation by it is that there's a developmental and or genetic fixation of these tendencies. And yeah, when we looked at this model, we controlled also, again, for the other factors that I mentioned, and we found that, actually that local adult females in images, it was a similar pattern. So they also had they had also higher appearing probabilities than the born-in ones. And of course, with this study design, we cannot yet disentangle the effects of whether this is a genetic or an innate effect or learned developmental effect during ontogeny, but due to studies from captivity and other image studies, we know that it's likely a combination of both. Yeah. So let's sum it up now, what I've shown to you. First, we have seen that migrants and locals differ in their cultural feeding repertoires, nesting tree repertoires. I've shown to you that migrant orangutans can make use of peering to learn about new habitat after dispersal. Migrants also have the potential to act as cultural vectors by being subject of social learning via peering by local adult females and imagers. And the fourth main message is that resource availability affects actually adult peering opportunities and propensities on the proximate level for migrants, but not locals, and on the ultimate level for both. And what could be the potential benefit of this? So migrants, of course, through this behavior, they might acquire local knowledge and avoid the cost of trial and error learning, especially when moving into a new area. And it might also be a nice way to sample the social composition of the local population. Females, locals, for example, they might benefit in two ways. So first, they might benefit by acquiring rare or novel knowledge that can improve and update their already existing knowledge, which might be beneficial given the reproductive constraints on female fitness. And secondly, females might also benefit through their offspring exposure to these migrants by the mechanisms of kin selection, since young orangutans in that way have a chance not only to acquire valuable information and ecological knowledge in preparation for their later adult life, but also social interactions with them. Yeah. But I think it became quite clear that in order for this benefit to be reaped, social tolerance is actually the key. And if we come back to our first slide with the hominid evolution, we think that the results of this thesis shows that ecological conditions indeed have far-reaching consequences on the necessity, on the propensity, and also the opportunity for social learning between non-kin individuals. And I said, of course, that the archaeological record is not really possible to reconstruct early human social learning conditions, or the biases at least, but due to our common ancestry with orangutans and the presence also of peering in the other great apes, I would really expect an evolutionary continuity in the general ability to engage in social learning from non-kin individuals within the hominid lineage. And we therefore like to propose also that there are two specific traits that likely provided individuals with a survival advantage when migrating to new areas. The first would be the ability to assess whether or not to engage in social learning from a non-kin individual, depending on the on-current ecological conditions and the individual's needs. And second, also natural selection likely favored than individuals that had an increased social learning propensity, since this in turn allowed them to enrich their own cultural repertoires, which positively affected their fitness. And over the course of hominid evolution, this ability then developed further alongside the different species social systems, social learning biases, as we see them today in our great ape relatives, but also in our own species. And with that, I'd like to end my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to hear from you about your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mörchen, for a really great talk. I'm sure we'll have some questions coming up now, either in the chat or people are welcome to put their hand up and I'll call on you. Just give it a second. Oh, John, yes. John, go ahead.
Sounds like a technical issue. I think so.
We cannot hear you, unfortunately, then, Mr. Gollet.
John, can you start again? Yeah, thanks. We still can't hear you.
Now you should hear me.
Yeah,
okay. Sorry about that. What I wanted to know is roughly how many species do the orangs exploit, and if they're migrants to another area, what kind of percentage difference, or how many different species would they encounter?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question. And to be very quickly, so we know what they eat. So within the study area, so we have like about 200 different food item combinations.
Right.
For example, in Tuanan and 242 in Sumatra. However, what is really missing at this point is like an assessment of the habitat structure and details on the different foods from the potential origins of these meals. And this is really the key point of the lack of knowledge we still have, because we don't know where they come from. If I might add, what we know from personal experience and being there for many years in these areas in Sumatra, the adjacent areas around the study areas are quite homogeneous. So it's really a peatland forest. And so we expect there's not so much differences in the habitat structure, food availability, in the type of species that grow there. In Tuanan, it's quite heterogeneous. So there's more variability to be expected. But we do not know where these may come from. So we don't know how different are these habitats in ecological terms.
Okay, but another fascinating thing I thought was, if I interpret your graph correctly, they take about 5 years to become fully adapted to the new area. Is that right?
You mean the graph about the peering, which goes down
with the green line, the green curve? Yeah.
Yeah. So there I presented only the peering events. So we see that they're still engaged in peering after many months and years, but it goes down. So yes, it can be a process of several years, but it could also be the case that orangutans, even adult, never stop peering at all. So they're just continuously doing this in their life. And the next step with the green line, as I pointed out, that is the next step. What we're going to do is to see whether this decrease in social learning goes along hand in hand with an increase in local ecological knowledge and competency. And this is very fascinating. It would give another line of evidence that peering is indeed a means of social learning and the adaptation process. Yeah, but it takes a lot of time, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. We have a question in the chat from Kenneth. Can your research be translated to chimpanzees and bonobos to a degree?
To a degree? Yes, totally. And there are so many cool people at the moment who are actually picking up more and more peering and social learning in general in chimpanzees and bonobos. And I'm also actually planning to do that in the future, 100%. And there are really cool publications coming out the last 2 years actually on peering in wild chimpanzees and bonobos. So check that out.
Great, thank you. I was going to ask what future research you had planned, but you've just kind of answered that question, unless you have something else in mind that you were thinking about.
Yes, I think what we really need, so first of all, so looking at peering in other great apes is fantastic. And something we're going to do, and many people are also trying to focus now on it. And the difficulty is, of course, that getting hand at this kind of data is very difficult. You need long-term data. So from wild populations, it needs established programs, study areas, and then after many, many years of observations, you can do this kind of analysis, what I've showed you here. Another very fascinating and very crucial point is to look at the actual benefit of how individuals benefit from the knowledge they learn via these peering moments. And there's discussion how to quantify that in the future. Of course, it's not possible to do kind of like lab experiments where you can separate the effects, but that would be a very interesting direction to look at, because that would be something very interesting, I think.
Great, thank you. We'll just see if anyone else has any other questions, or people are welcome to type in the chat as well.
Any colleagues just wanted to say something about the cultural transmission of migrants? I also would love to engage with the audience about if we have time for that, to learn how this could relate to their disciplines, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have time if people have any thoughts on that. Oh, we have a question in the chat from Johan asking, how will you go about assessing the effect of social learning?
It maybe goes into the question in the future, which I already mentioned, how to assess the benefit of the transmitted information. For example, it's really difficult because there's many different innovations that can be transferred via social learning. But there's, for example, one aspect of research looking at for example, medicinal value of, for example, plant knowledge. So this is more and more commonly found in studies that great apes can possess likely socially transmitted knowledge about healing properties of certain ingredients in the environment, like plants and herbs, and maybe using some termites, and to that they apply them onto wounds, or they ingest them in certain times when they're feeling sick. And this is like one way to somehow quantify maybe the value of the transmitted knowledge, in this case, the medicinal value, because then it could lead to an increase in the individual's fitness. Yeah, but how to quantify, that's still very difficult. And yeah, you could, for example, start about like making a catalog or collection of these different studies and assess the impact of these innovations in an overall term of these individual lives. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We'll just see if we have any more questions. I was wondering, you might not have the data, this might not be a relevant question, but if there's any difference in peering behavior among when you're directly observing orangutan populations and like taking video, or versus like remote sensing data, if their social behavior changes depending on like there being humans present or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. We're always concerned about that. So this has not been, so there's no, so of course, like when we go into the field, our aim is and our goal is to be as uninteresting and non-observant as possible. So we try to minimize our presence to not disturb the behavior. We want to see the natural behavior. But I don't think so far, like it has not been tested yet, but I don't think so far that the animals we have in our study areas, they are well habituated, and they are now they know the presence of observers for many years. So this is like research going on for over 15 years. So yeah, but this is a risk you always have to have in mind, of course. When you look at peering in captive individuals, I think it would be interesting to see whether it changes something, but then there are studies on general on how, like, for example, zoo visitors affect or interact even with zoo animals. And that could be interesting to be looked at in the terms of peering behavior in captivity, if there's a interaction. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting. John, do you have another question?
Yes, it's me again.
Yes. Go ahead.
I remember meeting Richard Wrangham in the forest in Uganda many years ago, and I was astonished by the number of species of plants that he said that the chimps knew. I can't remember what the number was now, but it was several hundred, I think. And it's kind of astonishing that they can know them separately, but not have language as we know it. Do you sense that the orangs know all these species kind of separately and individually?
Yes, definitely. So we have this long-term research going on, and we record, when we follow an individual, we record very in detail everything the individual eats, what it eats, how it eats it, what parts of the plant it might eat it. And we do this for over 15 years. So it's a very fine-grained window into the incredible knowledge these individuals, these animals have. It's really fascinating. And of course, they don't do it randomly. So yeah, there are studies also to look at movement parameters and cognition and how they move through the areas and choose certain foods. But this is definitely a huge knowledge they have. And there are comparisons about diet knowledge between species, which differ in their complexity and then, of course, in their content. But even within the same species that are separate by a river, they already have totally different dietary profiles, which also is suggestive of cultural differences, despite living in a very same or very similar habitat. And these, now adding the layer of social learning evidence in young orangutans, that they particularly pay attention to these different items. These are, and the orangutan infants and images, they learn this over many, many years from their mothers, adds that this is actually learned and not a genetically distinct program. So yeah, it's fascinating. They have a huge, it's like a treasure they have in their minds, and especially like older orangutans, what they must know and what they have seen it's really fascinating.
Thanks.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions coming up in the chat, but we'll just give it like a few seconds, see if anyone else puts their hand up. Okay, yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'd just like to say thank you again, Dr. Mörchen, for a really, really great talk. Thank you everyone for attending. This is our last webinar of the semester, but we will be back probably February 2026. We'll update you as usual on the mailing list and all that sort of thing. So yeah, thanks everybody for attending, and thanks again, Dr. Mörchen.
Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.